Hi, everybody. Um, this is Mr. Shornor's school communication videos during the pandemic, 2020. Some crazy times, actually. Just so we have a chance to look back on this video in 10 years and go, oh, yeah, that was that time, right? What I want to talk to you a little bit about today is the stuff that we finished off in the last video. We talked about the Etruscans and the impact of the Etruscans on the Romans, and ultimately the kicking out of the Etruscans by the Romans by this sort of event known as the Rape of Lucretia, which you'll find the information on the website from that. But what I want to move on to now is the time period after that, where Rome transforms into what is known as the Roman Republic. And that's about 2,500 years ago, so like 509 BCE, I believe, somewhere in that range, is when it kind of begins. And it lasts for like 500 years in various forms. So the Roman Republic, a republic is characterized by there is no king. There's no dictator, that sort of thing. What they have is some kind of the beginnings of this sort of rule by the people. The republic is ruled by a senate. It's a group of men that were put in place for life, and they would be the ones who would rule Rome in various ways. Lots of sort of yelling and screaming and fighting and ever, but there was no dictatorship and no sort of like one ruler. Having said that, what they would do is they put in place a sort of a king, but not just one, two of them. They're known as consuls, and the consuls would be set up to rule Rome for 1 year. And then a new consul would be put in, and a new consul, whatever. But there were two of them, so they had to agree. When they didn't always agree, but that would stop a lot of the ideas of a dictator rising. So that's the that's what's going on in the Republic, and this sort of new ways of doing things. And they really fought hard against the concept of dictator and dictatorship. This brings us sort of along. I mean, it didn't always mean that the government was good, but it was at least if you had bad leaders, you only lasted for a year. So this brings us then to the time we're kind of getting into the time of like Alexander the Great over in Greece, and that time period. And from this era, we see some other big figures come up during the Roman Republic. We see a guy named Appian Claudius, who's an engineer, a construction engineer, and he starts to develop some of the really cool things that we see from ancient Rome. We see this thing's known as the Appian Way, which are these sort of military roads that were built to allow the Roman military to get to hotspots very quickly, as opposed to through mud or dirt roads or whatever. They had these roads that were built, they were made out of stone, and they were totally straight. It allowed them to get to the places where there was rebellion or emergency or whatever. So we got this Appian Claudius is in sort of this Appian Way. We see the first these sort of big giant water bridges that allowed water to come into Rome from the outside, sometimes up to like 80 miles away. And these big water bridges would cross the big sort of like the valleys and stuff like that. So the water would come at a consistent rate downhill, essentially, all the way into Rome. And these bridges are called aqueducts. And again, you'll see all this stuff on the website. And then a couple of other things, during this time period, we see the creation of a big building called Circus Maximus. And it was used for chariot races. And it was overlooked by the palaces of the important people, the nobility, on the Palatine Hill, which is the hill where Romulus and Remus fought and Rome begins. All right, so that's kind of where we are from the start of this thing, is the Appian Way, and a couple of interesting architectural things. But this brings us in all the way to sort of halfway through the Roman Republic to something known as the Punic Wars. And again, if you look on the website, you'll find the heading for this. This is the Punic Wars, and it's the Punic Wars that ultimately lead to the Roman Empire, the famous Roman Empire. Right? The Punic Wars were a series of 3 wars. They're another one of the P wars. Like we did, the Peloponnesian War. We did we did Persian War first. Then we did Peloponnesian War. Then the Punic War. So these are kind of like the three major sort of P wars that we're going to talk about. But this one involves sort of a developing Rome, and Rome, controls the area around Rome, but doesn't control anything like overseas or that type of thing. So what they end up doing is they end up fighting another group of people who are in the area. They live across the Mediterranean in modern day Tunisia. And the place is called Carthage. They're the Carthaginians. And it's this continuous sort of fighting between the Carthaginians and the Romans that ultimately sees Rome become victorious. And whether they really wanted to or not, they ended up having to sort of take over the area, and they took over the area across the Mediterranean as well. So their first sort of overseas holdings. So you have the First Punic War, Second Punic War, and the Third Punic War. Some of the major figures during this period are Second Punic War. We see a Carthaginian general named Hannibal, famous general, really good general too, actually. There were some great Roman generals too as well, Scipio Africanus, but Hannibal is another sort of famous one. And Hannibal's famous for having a sort of these herds of elephants with him to sort of carry things, and he ultimately, decided to attack Rome from the north, which the Romans thought was impossible, and he ended up, taking a lot of these elephants through the Alps, these major mountain range in the northern part of Italy and into the other parts of Europe. So now the elephants were not that successful. They were scary. Not many survived. It was harsh. It was wintry and stuff. But he's famous for Hannibal and his elephants. And Hannibal made it into Italy and modern day Italy and had a lot of success. Never actually attacked Rome though. He kept waiting for other people, other groups to sort of join him to actually attack Rome. Right? And the Romans had a lot of disastrous battles against Hannibal. Ultimately, we moved it to the Third Punic War, and this is a Roman attack on actual Carthage itself. And the Romans are victorious. Hannibal is forced to come home and fight, and ultimately loses. And the Romans salt the earth, put salt into the earth, and so that the Carthaginians couldn't come back and grow anything because the soils were ungrowable. Is that a word? Ungrowable? Anyway. What else I want to talk a little bit about here? Well, okay, so ultimately this brings us to the end of the Roman Republic, where we see one of the famous Roman generals. His name is Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar is a leader of an entire section of the Roman army, and the rule is, like, the Roman armies are not allowed to come back to Rome. Rome had its own military, but the Roman armies had to live outside of Rome, usually like in another city, another country. Lived in Italy, in England, or they lived in Gaul, which is modern day France, or they lived in Spain. But at one point, Julius Caesar brings his army back to Rome, and because he sees the need, or he thinks he sees the need for a strong leadership, he thinks that Rome is being led by a weak group. So he comes into Rome essentially and takes over. The Senate is not so thrilled by this whole prospect, that this one guy is coming in, because that was the whole point, really, wasn't it? To have a Senate and consul was to avoid dictatorship. But what we get is Julius Caesar coming in and taking over Rome, and the city of Rome, and the area in Rome, and the Senate isn't so thrilled by that, and this is the famous sequence where Julius Caesar is killed by the Senate. They said they literally surround him and stab him to death. Right? And it was on March 15th in 44 BCE, and this is a famous date. The March 15th is known as the Ides of March, and 44 BCE is this time period where essentially the first dictator of Rome was assassinated. And from there we get, a variety of so what happens next? Well, after Caesar, the empire is divided essentially into two pieces by this guy named his nephew Octavian and his lieutenant general named Marcus Antonius. We know of him as Mark Antony. Mark Antony gets Egypt and some of the outlying areas, and Octavian gets Rome. And I know that makes sense here. Like you can sort of see the writing on the wall, and that you're ultimately due for, like, you can't have two leaders of the Roman Empire. So in the end, there's this sort of a significant battle, and we see the ending of the two, and we're left with one emperor, and that emperor is Octavian, who ultimately changes his name to Caesar Augustus and becomes the first emperor of the Roman Empire. Caesar Augustus, right? Marcus Antonius was this other general, right? He's the one who, if you recall from the past, he was together with Cleopatra, and in the end they both die, and Octavian, or Caesar Augustus, is left as the sole emperor of the Roman Empire, the first.